Hi, my name is Ali Lawati. I'm a doctor from Oman, which is a country in the Middle East. I specialize in internal medicine and I'm currently working in the Department of Endocrinology. I run the lifestyle medicine clinic at the hospital. So, the way I was introduced to low carb diets is a funny story, really. I was 15 years old at the time and I'm type 1 diabetic. I was started on the regular orthodox diet for type 1 diabetes, which is high carb, low fat diet. And at the time, I had to match my carb intake with insulin. So I was eating more carbs, more insulin, more carbs, more insulin, till I ended up gaining a lot of weight. And I always say this, I used to look like Shrek. Unfortunately, I had evidence of nephropathy, early nephropathy. That means my kidneys were affected because of diabetes and I had protein in my urine. And so at that age, I was overweight, teenager who's overweight, so I really wanted to lose weight. I didn't know how. So I used to go sit with my grandfather every evening and he'd sit with his friends out in the front in the little garden that he had. And I remember one of his friends specifically, I really remember him because he was this grumpy old man. He's, always angry, always grumpy. And I remember his driver would drop him right next to the gate and he'd walk in on a cane and really slowly he'd come and then collapse on the chair and start complaining about his knee pain, about all the problems that he has, his diabetes, his hypertension, everything. And then for some reason, I can't remember why, I didn't go to sit with them for perhaps 4 or 5 months. And 4 or 5 months later, I went again and we were sitting there with all my grandfather's other friends, but he wasn't there. And so I look at the gate and I see a man entering and he's marching in, literally. And I could realize it was the same person, but he looked 10 years younger. He had lost at least 10, 15 kilos. And he was marching in and he was smiling. I had never, ever remembered, I'd never seen that person smile before. So it was like, wow. So he came in and sat down and my jaw literally dropped. I was like, and so my grandfather was sitting next to me and I was like, this chubby little person. And I'm like poking my grandfather, asked him to tell you what did he do? How did he lose all the weight? So eventually my grandfather did ask him and he gave him a little piece of paper that read low carbohydrate diets and it was written in Arabic. So I read it and it said eat fat to lose weight. And I'm like, this guy is mad. He's killing himself. What's he doing? So immediately I call up my grandfather. I'm like to him, listen, this guy has to stop this diet. It's going to kill him. So my grandfather goes like, no, wait, he's improving. He lost the weight. He's happier. His knee pain disappeared. His diabetes is better. His hypertension is better. And then I thought to myself, well, yeah, I did see him and he looked great. So there must be something. So I looked it up online and I was amazed at the amount of literature information that was there supporting this. And nobody was talking about this. So I remember printing out 3 journal articles, and then I went to my endocrinologist and I showed him the article and he looks at me and goes like, no, this is fats. You're type 1 diabetic. You're going to die. I'm like, no, but I want to lose weight. He's like, no, there are other ways, not this. So I left him, went to another one. So I went to 3 different doctors who turned me down. Then I took these articles and I went to my father. I went to my father, Dad, look, this looks very safe. There is evidence. At the time, there was no evidence for type 1 diabetes, mind you. There was just evidence for type 2 diabetes and obesity. And there was evidence and it seemed safe. And my aim was to lose weight, not to control my diabetes, because I had no idea it would control my diabetes. Right. But then when I looked it up further, I had to reduce my insulin doses. So at the time, my A1C was at 8.7. I was overweight. I had evidence of nephropathy, proteinuria, and my total insulin dose was 84 units per day, which for a 15-year-old was a big dose. But then I was overweight, I had type 1 diabetes, but also insulin resistance because of the weight that I had. So then initially I halved my dose and I started on diet. And after 3 months, I checked my A1C and it was 6, from 8.7 to 6 on half the insulin dose. And even checking my blood glucose all around the day, it was in the normal level. And then 3 months later, that's 6 months after I'd started, my A1C went from 8.7 to 5.
Wow.
And I further reduced my insulin doses, and I checked my urine for proteins, and there were no proteins anymore. And I was like, wow, this was brilliant. And so I was actually, at that age, I was happier about the way I looked, because, you know, Shrek to this. But then it was doing things to my diabetes that I had no idea it would do, you know, such improvement. And then I remember I started medical school maybe perhaps a few months later, 8 months later or something. And when I went to medical school, of course, everybody was looking at me weird. It was like, oh, that's the weird guy who eats cheese and meat, but no bread. And I remember standing out, like, you know, everybody would look at me in the cafeteria, look at what that guy's eating. And yeah, it was funny. And I'd also have to argue or have debates with my professors and you know, all my teachers and my colleagues as well, because no one was convinced. But eventually they got on board, and I remember a few of my professors, you know, started the ketogenic diet and were on board with it. So that was through medical school. And when I graduated, I was doing my internship training. So during my internship, I rotated in different hospitals and I presented the same thing to all of them. And again, I had people coming on board with it, you know, starting the keto diet. And then I started my residency training in internal medicine. And 2 years after I started my residency training, I was asked to start the ketogenic way at the National Endocrine Center in Oman. And that's the biggest endocrine center in the country. So I had the pleasure to train 2 dietitians and nurses and doctors about this. It was brilliant. It was working really well. And then after that, I had read Dr. Westman's diet, Dr. Eric Westman's book, rather. And so I emailed him and I said, oh, I want to come see how you do your diet thing. So I was surprised that he replied, and he's like, yeah, you're welcome, come anytime. I was like, wow, that's really cool. So I did. I went to North Carolina to Duke University, and I did a month at his clinic. And then while I was there, I was telling people my story, and someone pointed out that this sounds like a lot like Dr. Bernstein's story, where he reversed his complications of diabetes. And I had no idea who Dr. Bernstein was. So they arranged for me to go to meet Dr. Bernstein, and I did. Wow. I went to meet Dr. Bernstein, and I was like, wow, this is brilliant. So I was with him for a week, and I went back home, and then I went back to Dr. Bernstein recently, last year, and I spent around maybe 5 to 6 weeks with him in the clinic. Wow. So I learned from Dr. Westman, Dr. Bernstein, and now I went back home, and I started something very similar to what they do back home, similar practice.
Wow. So what are your plans for the future?
So I'm planning on probably influencing, if not changing, the way diabetes is managed in my country, in Oman. It's going to be a huge challenge because I'm not a dietitian, I'm a doctor, and I might even have to get a degree in nutrition or something in nutrition to be able to say this for people to listen to me. Although back home, just to mention this for the people, is that doctors during their courses or their 7 years of medical training, they don't study nutrition. They have no idea about food or what food can do. And it's funny that almost all doctors give nutritional advice, although they have no idea where it came from. So if you read medical books, the guides that we use to treat our patients, they do mention low-fat diets in places where you have high cholesterol, heart disease. Oh, it's a low-fat diet. That's what you should follow. But the evidence is not mentioned, and the doctors don't even know where it comes from. But they still prescribe it to people. They still talk about it. And it's funny, when I go and say this, of course, their initial response is like, that guy's mad. Like, that's the guy who says fat is good. But eventually, when I show them the evidence, they get on board as well, because the evidence is so strong for this. So it just makes sense.
Huh. That's amazing. So in the States, doctors or MDs are afraid to prescribe this to patients because they could lose their license. Is that something that's a concern in Oman?
That's true. So if I prescribe something that's out of the guidelines, then I am at risk to be taken to court, to be sued. It doesn't happen as much in Oman as it does in the United States, but there's still a chance. But then again, when I look at this, I think about all the studies that support this. And so we actually have a big chunk of people on this diet currently, and almost all of them are doing so well. So there is evidence to support this. So I'm not really scared, although I do expect maybe somewhere down the line, someone might come up and say, oh, you started me on this, let's go to court, let's get me a few thousand, a few grand. Yeah, but I'm not scared because the evidence is so robust that I think I have a strong case.
Defense, yeah.
Absolutely.
Slowly becoming more popular, the diet. Are you seeing that?
It is, definitely. So when I started 15 years ago, nobody had heard of it. Nobody knew what it was. But slowly, it's picking up. Slowly, more and more people are becoming aware that it exists, even if they're not doing it themselves, but they've known someone who did it, or they've read about it somewhere. So the trend is, it's picking up.
Right.
Yeah, and there are lots of these private diet centers that start their patients on a semi-low carb diet. So patients or people do know the existence of these diets, although maybe they think the ketogenic diet is too extreme for them to follow. But then again, when I have a new patient to describe to them what it does, what the diet does, I ask them to think way back, to go way back to the Stone Age. Yeah. I call it the Stone Age because so it's probably not the Stone Age, some of these eras. But so I go back to them, so what do you reckon people ate in the Stone Age? So a lot of them say vegetables and fruits. I go like, well, there were vegetables and fruits, but they were seasonal. Almost all the foliage that was around, that's probably toxic. But people depended on hunting. Yeah. They got they hunted and they got their prey, and then they ate the prey, and it was mostly meat and fat. Right. They did get fruits and vegetables, but seasonally, meaning every 3, 4, 5 months, who knows, depending on where they were. So, and the other thing is that people didn't eat every day. So the human body's requirement for food is very small. We have a saying in Arabic that it's just a few bites that are required to keep you healthy and alive. So, so this is one of the things that I mentioned. And then they asked me about all these grains and these other things. So one of the things that I tell them is to look at the ancient Egyptians. So the ancient Egyptians is one of these civilizations that was very dependent on grains and fruits for survival. That's almost all what they ate was grains and fruits and honey. Very little poultry, very little meat. Actually, they only ate meat when their, let's say, bulls or cows would die because they'd use them for agriculture. Right. So if you look at them, and it was, mind you, like whole grain stuff, all the good stuff, like all the dietitians go like, wow, yes, this is what you should eat. And then when you look at the Egyptians, they've actually preserved their bodies very well in the form of mummies. And so scientists actually took these mummies and put them through coronary or cardiac CTs. And what they found was amazing. They found that almost all of them had evidence of heart disease, starting at a very young age of almost 13 years old. Yeah, and actually the first description of heart attacks in history is probably written on the papyrus in hieroglyphics. It said he held his left breast and fell dead. Wow. So they actually had heart disease. They had evidence, clinical evidence, tissue evidence of heart disease, and that's what they ate. That's what they ate. So this is another argument that I tell my patients that look at them, they ate grains, healthy, whole grain stuff, and still they got heart disease. And mind you, they were low fat. So low fat, high carb, high fiber. Yeah, well, I'd tell people not to be scared of this, to try it, give it a chance, because almost all the people, and myself included, say that this changed our lives. And so our lives before and after are very different. And it's a much better improvement of life quality. Everything improves, especially for diabetes. I mean, this is for general people, but for diabetes, specifically diabetes, their lives definitely change. So don't be scared. Talk to someone who knows about this and start on it. Try it 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. See how it goes. And you won't regret it.
Of course, everybody thinks if you eat high fat, it's going to be you're going to have cardiovascular ramifications from that.
Right.
What can you say about that?
So, one of the things that we're scared of as people and doctors and everybody is cholesterol. So we're all scared of cholesterol. And so it turns out on a high-fat, low-carb diet, the quality of cholesterol improves. One of the things that I talk about is eating a lot of eggs. I believe that eggs are the best proteins available in nature, the highest quality proteins available in nature. And they're so complete that you actually have a chick coming out of it, like a living thing out of an egg. In my clinic, I have this little poster saying an egg a day keeps the doctor away. It's not apples anymore, it's probably eggs. So there are lots of studies that looked at the effect of eggs on cholesterol. And they found that eggs actually change the quality of cholesterol. Of course, when we check cholesterol, you check LDL, total cholesterol, HDL, and triglycerides. But it doesn't tell you the quality of this LDL cholesterol. So if you send the sample to the lab, it actually measures the volume of cholesterol, not the number of particles or the quality of cholesterol. So if you look at eggs, there are lots of studies that did this, and this has been seen in most of them, is that if you feed 100 people, let's say 5 eggs per day, you see that 75% of them, their cholesterol doesn't change. It remains the same. And they call them hypo-responders. And 25% of these people, their cholesterol, their LDL increases, the reading on that test that we spoke about. So because of this, previously they said, oh no, you shouldn't eat eggs because, LDL increases if you eat eggs, and we know that, in patients with heart disease, LDL is high. Although there's not a direct link, but it's an assumption that since this increases this, that could cause that, there's no direct link. But so recently, well, not very recently, but a few years ago, they were able to look at these LDL molecules and subdivide them into different particles. They divide them according to size and density. So they call them the large fluffy ones and the small dense ones. So they saw that they took the same people, fed them eggs, and saw that these people whose LDL increased, they further studied them with a nuclear magnetic resonance imaging to look at these particle sizes. And they saw that the increased consumption of egg actually didn't increase the number of particles of cholesterol, but the size of particles, making them larger and more fluffy and more buoyant. So if you look at the comparison, if you have a smaller cholesterol molecule, so studies have shown that it doesn't stick to cholesterol receptors as well. And because of the small size and larger surface area, it gets oxidized more, which is bad. Right. And then because of the small size, if it passes through the blood vessels, it can actually enter the blood vessels, enter the endothelium. Right. All right, and then it goes there and causes this reaction that results in atherosclerosis. So these tiny little guys are actually the bad guys. Right. But if you increase the size of these tiny little guys, make them all more larger and fluffy, it's all the opposite. It makes them better. So they stick better to the LDL receptors, they get used up better, and because of their larger size, their surface area is smaller. So they don't get oxidized as much. And because they're larger, they bounce off the walls, so they don't even cause that much atherosclerosis. Right. So going back to your question, so heart disease, we're scared of atherosclerosis, but if you increase the size of small dense lipids, small dense LDL to larger, more fluffy LDL, which is what happens on a low carb diet, it's protective. So even if the values increase, so we said these 25% of people, their LDL levels increased, which is scary for any doctor to see, like, oh, I start my patients let's hit them with medications. But in reality, this increase is actually protective. So I hope this answers your question.
Yes, brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah.